Thank you, sir. We have amongst us Shri Gurucharan, CEO, Indian Council of Overseas Employment, Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. I invite him to give the valedictory address.
Vice Chancellor Dr. Pillai, distinguished members on the dais, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm aware that as the last speaker of the day, indeed the last speaker of the conference, I run the risk of saying many things that have been perhaps said several times over the last 2 days. So I'm going to try and be brief. I don't have a prepared speech. But what I'm going to do is to try and reflect on some of the themes in the backdrop of India's experience, raise some questions on how we can move forward on the whole question of diasporas, development and migration. Let me begin by saying that I'm very happy to be here this evening because this is a truly distinguished gathering of scholars, academics and policymakers. And I must congratulate Vice Chancellor Pillai and his team for putting together an excellent conference. Much as I would have liked to have attended at least some of the sessions of the conference, I was unable to. But I must tell you that I've read every one of the abstracts that were sent to me, and some of them were truly outstanding in their quality. I'm going to begin with an important paper and presentation made by Professor Mark Boyle when he spoke of diaspora policy and strategy and how learning can be shared between diasporic countries and what might constitute the ingredients for success. I think at a generic level, most countries have only recently, in the last 10 years to my mind, begun to look at their diasporas. Otherwise, no policy was a policy. Ambivalence was another policy. But it's only in the last decade, certainly for India, that we have started looking at a focused policy that would give mainstream attention to the diaspora. I must hasten to add that I use the term diaspora with some degree of discomfort because it has a specific historical context, and more than that, in a practical sense, it tends to blur the line that divides those who were born in the home country and now live as citizens overseas, many of them as nationals of the home country, and those who were born abroad. In India, for instance, we count the people of Indian origin who are foreign nationals as also the non-resident Indians who are Indian nationals as part of the great Indian diaspora. So I would commend to all scholars that we use the term diaspora carefully, a little more rigorously perhaps. I'm also a little circumspect about the generic use of the term development. I'm not quite sure in what context we speak of development. To me, development would mean something that is transformational, not something that can be measured merely in terms of dollars and cents or remittances, or indeed skills. So when, in the context of Professor Mark Boyle's paper, let me share some of the experiences that India had. The first was we recognized early on, and this is only in the last 10 years, that the overseas Indian community needs mainstream attention, and there must be a mechanism by which we can engage with the overseas Indian community. And that's how a focal point in the form of an independent ministry for the overseas Indian community was established. But I would think that if we have to enable overseas communities to participate in the development process of the home country, you need three necessary conditions. The first, I would think, is that the engagement with the overseas community has to be sustainable, it has to be symbiotic, and it has to be mutually beneficial. When I say mutually beneficial, not just for the home country and its overseas community, but indeed for the country which is the host country, where the overseas community works and lives. The second is that I think we need to infuse a strategic element to the engagement. It is certainly not the case that the diaspora in general or the overseas community in general has the ability or the willingness to engage with the home country. Indeed, if you were to actually analyze the overseas communities on an ability-willingness axis, you will find that there are 4 quartiles, and on quartile 1 or A quartile, you will have those who are high on ability and high on willingness. Obviously, that will be the first constituency that you would like to engage with. Then you have those who are high on ability but low on willingness. They need to be incentivized to engage with the home country. And then you have those who are high on willingness but low on ability. You need to empower them to be able to engage with the home country. So, I think rather than speaking of gross approaches, we need a more focused, discrete approach. That's why I call it strategic engagement. And finally, the third element that went into India's policy was, we said there are no quick fixes, there are no easy results. We need to focus in our engagement with the overseas Indian community on a medium to long-term basis and look for results for both sides on a mutually beneficial basis over a medium to long-term perspective. But this in itself does not constitute the sufficient condition. Having a well-articulated policy or a well-articulated precise strategy. And that brings me to another outstanding paper in this conference by Metka Herzog, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, and her colleague, which speaks of the importance of the environment in the host country to enable the overseas community to actually engage with the home country. We recognized early on in India that not only do we need institutions and a conducive environment in the host country, more important, we realized, was to create a conducive environment in the home country. Let me share with you perceptions of people in India when we organized the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, which is the annual gathering of overseas Indians. Many distinguished Indians, resident Indians, often wonder why it is that the overseas Indians have started looking at India far more actively now than they did in the past. Indeed, many of them who are the hawks would say, we made this country happen. And at a time when we were facing adverse circumstances, these people left for better pastures overseas. So what India is today is because of us, and now it is that they return to ask for political power, voting rights, and various other benefits. This is a perspective. But I think it's important to recognize that when we speak of diaspora and development, we need to question whether the conditions that obtain in a country and the institutions in the home country or in the host country actually lend themselves to enable the overseas communities to actually contribute and participate in the development process. And the other element that I found interesting in that paper was the fact that they focused on the scientific community. And barring that one paper and perhaps some passing references in certain other knowledge network papers, I did not see any major focus on science and technology and leveraging the scientific and technological resources of overseas communities in home country development. Assume for a moment, and I'm actually a skeptic, I approach this whole theme of diaspora and development with a great deal of circumspection. Assume for a moment that the necessary condition of a well-articulated policy and strategy is in place and the sufficient condition of conducive environments in the host and home countries as well as institutions have been established. I would still wonder what kind of a role the diasporas and the overseas communities can play in the development of the home country. Because to my mind, there isn't enough evidence-based research that points to any significant finding that overseas communities have been drivers for development. Let me look at 4 parameters of development which typically represent the 4 key areas that are spoken of, whether in conferences on the diaspora and development or conferences on international migration, and indeed in this conference as well. Let's say foreign direct investment. And I speak for India. The foreign direct investment from overseas Indians has been minuscule, less than 1%. Indeed, if you look at the horizon of the overseas Indian investor, typically it is short-term horizon of 3 to 4 years. Much of the money that they might want to invest is parked in what are called bank deposits. Contrast this with the view taken by foreign companies or foreigners who are not people of Indian origin. They have invested on a longer term basis, 10 to 12-year investments, which means that they have taken a position that they think that India is a country with a favorable destination investment prospect. Let's take remittances. You know, you'll always hear, it's very well known, widely spoken about, that India is the highest recipient of remittances at 54 billion. True. But what is less known is the fact that there is no evidence to suggest that this has great multiplier effects or that it has gone into investment. Indeed, there is one paper in this conference, presented in this conference, which says that there is no multiplier effect. Much of it goes towards consumption of the families, maintenance of families. But even less known is the fact that close to 40% of our remittances come from workers in the Gulf. So, whether in the aggregate or per capita, the worker in the Gulf actually remits more money than the overseas Indians in the Northern Hemisphere. Why is that so? Not so much because they love India more or those in the Northern Hemisphere love India less. It is simply the imperative of the fact that they've left their families behind. Those who go to the Gulf cannot take their families. They are primarily contract laborers who need to come back. So they remit larger sums of money. Take skills, for instance. There have been efforts over the last decade or more to create several virtual platforms and other platforms to try and leverage the knowledge resources of the overseas communities. SANSA is a good example. Top 10 is a good example. The Global Inc. of the Indian Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs is a good example. All of these have sought to try and leverage the skills and resources of the overseas community. The impact of these have been limited at best. So I think the argument that diasporas can make a remarkable difference to the development of home countries is overstated. Why is that so? Why is it that in my view, ex ante or a priori, there is a limitation to the role that overseas communities can play in the development of home countries? I think we need to have a sense of history to understand diaspora in the Great Lakes region by Arvind Gabo, I think. An excellent paper. That is, of course, in the context of the ethno-security situation around Rwanda. But let me try to give you the other dark side of the diaspora as I see it. How did the diasporas emerge? To my mind, they emerged because of three major migratory movements, great migratory movements. The first was in the age of mercantilism or the merchant capital, and where the great trade routes and along with it, along with the movement of goods, resources, came the movement of people. The second was the age of colonialism or colonial capital. Again, mass movement of people from one continent to another. And the third was the post-Great Depression and post-World War II movements, where again there was, after the independence of the old colonies, you also had the phenomenon of the twice removed or the twice migrated populations. What is common, I might ask, in all of these three great migratory movements? To my mind, what is common was the dialectic of development. The mode of production and the mode of accumulation of capital and the mode of appropriation of surplus in all of these three great migratory movements was based on the coercive mobilization of resources and, more important, the coercive mobilization of labor. You had, during the merchant capital age, slavery. You had, during the colonial capital age, the indentured labor system. You had, during the post-colonial age, the drawing of the newly freed colonies and the twice removed populations to many of the old colonial powers. And of course, the migration, the new migration that occurred of professionals and skilled professionals. Now, if you look at today in the age of globalization, what is it that we see? We see the Bretton Woods institutional system, you have the WTO, you have a rule-based international trading regime. Quite simply, and I want to say this with all the emphasis at my command, today in the age of globalization, we live in a world where the movement of capital and goods is seen as a virtue. But the movement, the natural movement or the movement of natural persons is not seen as a good thing. So what is the world that we live in today? The three stark facts that I want to place before you. One, in the last 30-40 years, you will see that the asymmetry between nation states, the distance has widened, and worse still, even for those countries or those nation states which have made rapid economic progress, such as China and India, if you look at the Gini coefficient, you will see that in-country, intra-country, the distance has widened between the rich and the poor. The second fact is the proliferation of free trade agreements, regional trade agreements, arrangements for easier movement of goods and services. But the third and important fact, bigger, taller, more difficult barriers for the mobility of people. So let me not dwell too much on this, except to conclude with what I believe are the three key implications for nation states if we are looking at diaspora and development, or overseas communities and development. The first is to recognize, every nation state to recognize that leveraging overseas community resources, or leveraging or hoping to leverage the overseas community's knowledge and skills is not a substitute for a robust development policy. India's progress in the last 20 years has been driven primarily by domestic capital, primarily by domestic labor, primarily by domestic markets and demand. So while overseas communities can and will doubtless play an important role, perhaps add value, I don't think any developing country should miss the wood for the trees by imagining that if they start encouraging remittances, providing easier ways for people to come back and work, that all the problems of poverty, of poor health, of poor education will disappear. It is certainly not the case. The second implication really is that when we speak of engaging the diaspora for development, or engaging the overseas community for development, I think every nation state should select strategic engagement, strategic objectives over a strategic period of time. When I speak of strategic engagement, what I refer to is to look at the nature of your own overseas community, the stage of development of your own country, the stage of development of the host country in which the largest part of your overseas population resides. Look at the dialectic of your relationship with those host countries, and then determine what the competitive advantage for you is. India, for instance, is looking seriously at engaging with the scientific and technological community of overseas Indians. Why is that so? Because we have empirical evidence, and this has been referred to in some of the papers that have been written for this conference, notably the work of Anna Lee Saxenian, done a decade ago and updated recently, that overseas Indians and overseas Chinese actually triggered a wave, a spurt of innovation in the knowledge-based industries in the United States. Now they are beginning to return to drive innovation back home. Why is that so? Simply because they perceive that the conditions for driving innovation are better in India today than perhaps they are in current day United States. This would be a strategic intervention. The other is, and I must compliment the entire panel on diasporic writings. I thoroughly enjoyed all the papers that were written for that particular session. And I think there is great value in looking at the emerging new cultural narrative from overseas communities, from the engagement of the overseas communities with host countries, whether in the United Kingdom, United States, Africa, or any part of the world. And I think this is an area, because finally, at the end of the day, life is not just about dollars and cents. It's also about many other areas of engagement. But before I conclude, let me emphasize the third implication and imperative. And that is, for far too long, the international discourse on migration and overseas communities has been dominated by the North. I think it's time that the South started looking at international discourse, influencing the pace and the direction of this discourse. Simply because the third implication for nation states is to recognize that the next frontier of globalization is going to be international migration. notwithstanding the fact we live in a post-crisis world, where in all of Europe there has been a swing to the right, there are strong anti-migrant sentiments. But this is not going to take away the fact that the demographic reality will ensure that if countries want to maintain their current growth rates, they will need young workers. And more important, as Professor Brij Maharaj mentioned in his remarks, there is going to be a serious skills shortage across the world in key sectors like healthcare. Geriatric nurses is a simple example. And if we are to meet the demand for and the supply of skill sets, then the natural corollary, the movement of goods and services and capital across borders, will be the natural movement of people. As J.K. Galbraith said almost 40 years ago, I think, migration is the oldest solution to poverty. It enables those, it helps those most in need. It helps the country to which they go. It helps the country break the equilibrium of poverty from where they come. What is it so perverse in the human soul that makes people oppose so obvious a good? I think this is really the question that will determine to what extent overseas communities can actually influence the development process around the world. Thank you very much for a patient hearing.